Preface by Brian Bailey. This is a fictionalized story inspired by my creative journey. I decided to tell it this way for a simple reason. The story I actually care about isn't about where I worked, who I worked with, or anything that happened there. Those things are part of my past, and they aren't what this is about. This is about what came next. Music started as an escape for me. It became a way to take things I was carrying around and put them somewhere else. I could take an emotion, a memory, a difficult day, or something I couldn't quite explain and turn it into a song. It helped me heal. Eventually, something changed. I wasn't creating because I needed to escape anymore. I was creating because I loved creating. One song became another. Then, the music started needing places to live. That eventually became Country Scars, Southern Sync, FrankenFusion, Fifth Echo, Lightly Bruised, Personal Glowth, and a growing collection of other artists and projects. Then came Brian Bailey Music Productions. Then books, stories, audiobooks, videos, characters, more artists, more channels, more ideas than I have time or money to create properly. Somewhere along the way, the thing I had originally started to help myself became the thing I wanted to spend my life doing. This story follows that journey. Some parts are based on things that really happened. Some events, circumstances, conversations, timelines, and details have been changed, combined, or fictionalized. The people and situations presented in the story should not be interpreted as representations of specific individuals or events. The music is different. The songs are real. The artists and projects are real. When this story reaches certain points in the journey, I'm going to stop talking and let you hear some of the music I was creating at the time. Some of it found an audience. Some of it didn't. Some of it represents moments that were important to me, even if almost nobody else noticed. That's part of the story too. I'm also telling this before I know how it ends. Brian Bailey Music Productions isn't some enormous entertainment company. Brian Bailey Author is still growing. The platform I want to build is still something I can't afford to build. There are books I haven't written yet, songs I haven't created yet, and ideas I haven't even had yet. I'm still in the middle of this. Maybe someday I'll look back at this period and realize I was standing right before everything changed. Maybe the future looks completely different from anything I'm imagining right now. I don't know. That's what makes this worth documenting now. You're not hearing the story after everything worked out. You're coming along while I'm still trying to make it work. This is where I came from. This is what I've built so far. And this is the story of how something I started because I needed an escape became something I never expected to build. Brian Bailey Music Productions, Brian Bailey Author. Part 1. Somewhere Else to Be. There was a time when none of this existed. No Country Scars. No Brian Bailey Music Productions. No collection of YouTube channels that required a list just to remember all of them. No books. No audiobooks. No fictional artists. No plans for clothing lines or streaming platforms. There was just Brian and a job. It was a good-paying job, too. The kind of job people generally tell you not to walk away from. The money was good. The bills got paid. From the outside, there wasn't much reason to complain. But a paycheck and happiness aren't the same thing. Brian wasn't happy. The reasons don't really matter. This isn't that story. What matters is that when he went home at the end of the day, he needed somewhere else to be for a while. He found it in music, not performing it. Not at first. Writing it. He would sit down and start putting words together. Sometimes they came from something he was feeling. Sometimes from something he'd experienced years earlier. Sometimes they were about relationships, regrets, anger, hope, or the things people carry around without ever really talking about them. Other times he just had an idea. What if somebody wrote a song about this? So he did. There was something strangely useful about taking a feeling that didn't make much sense inside his head and turning it into verses and a chorus. It gave the feeling somewhere to go. Once it was sitting on a screen in front of him, it wasn't quite as heavy anymore. That became the escape. Work could have the day. For a few hours at night, Brian could go somewhere else. He didn't have an audience waiting for the next song. Nobody was asking him to write one. There were no subscribers refreshing a page to see what he'd created. Most people didn't even know he was doing it. That wasn't the point. The point was that it helped. So he kept writing. One song became 2, 2 became 5, then 10. Some were better than others. Some probably should have remained between Brian and the computer they were written on. That's part of creating too. But every once in a while, he'd write something and read it back. This one was different. He could hear it, not literally, not yet, but he could hear what it was supposed to sound like. The guitar, the drums, the way the chorus should lift, where the singer should pull back, where the emotion should hit. The problem was that hearing a finished song inside your head and actually having a finished song are two very different things. So Brian started experimenting. He recorded some things himself. That opened another door. There was something different about hearing words that had existed only on a screen become an actual song. It didn't have to be perfect. That wasn't what mattered. It existed. Something that hadn't existed yesterday was playing through a set of speakers because Brian had decided to make it. That feeling was addictive. So naturally, he made another one. And then technology started changing. Tools became available that could do things Brian couldn't do by himself. Suno became one of them. Sometimes he could take something he'd recorded and import it, using his own starting point to develop the song further. Other times he could start with the lyrics and an idea of what the song should become. Suddenly, the distance between the music Brian could hear in his head and the music he could actually create became considerably smaller. So he experimented. Country, pop, rock. Things that didn't really belong in any obvious category. He wasn't thinking about branding. He wasn't thinking about algorithms. He wasn't building a record label. He certainly wasn't thinking about what all of this might look like years later. He was making things. That was enough. And slowly, without really noticing it happening, something else began to change. The music wasn't only helping him escape anymore. He was looking forward to creating it. An idea would come to him during the day and he'd hold on to it. A line, a title, a chorus, a story that might work as a song. He'd write it down somewhere so he wouldn't forget. Then he'd go home and see what he could turn it into. The day wasn't simply something he needed to get away from anymore. It was becoming the time between opportunities to create. That was different. Brian still had his job. He still went to work. He still had a normal life with normal responsibilities and normal bills waiting to be paid. Nothing had changed on paper, but something had changed. There was now another part of his life that belonged entirely to him. Nobody had assigned it. Nobody had hired him to do it. Nobody had given him permission. He didn't need any. He could write whatever he wanted. He could make whatever he wanted. If it was terrible, he could make something else. If it was good, he could listen to it again. There weren't really any consequences. There also weren't many rules. That freedom mattered more than Brian understood at the time, because eventually there were a lot of songs, and those songs had another problem. They didn't sound anything alike. One sounded like it belonged on country radio. Another sounded like pop. Another was experimental. Another was something Brian wasn't entirely sure how to describe. Putting all of them together didn't make much sense. Brian had started creating music because he needed somewhere for his thoughts to go. Now the music needed somewhere to go too. So he started giving it places to live. He didn't know it yet, but that small decision was about to become something much larger, because the songs were going to need names. The names were going to need channels, and the channels were eventually going to need somewhere they could all belong. Brian hadn't set out to build any of it. He just wanted somewhere else to be for a while. He found it. Then he kept building there. Part 2. The music needed somewhere to go. Creating the music turned out to be the easy part. Aside from loving it and listening to it himself, figuring out what to do with it was becoming considerably more complicated. Brian wasn't creating one kind of music. That would have made things easier. He could have created a channel, put his name on it, uploaded everything there, and been done. Instead, one song sounded like modern country. The next sounded like something that belonged 20 years earlier. Then there was rock, pop, experimental stuff, songs that were serious, songs that weren't, songs built around stories, songs built around a single line Brian had thought of while doing something completely unrelated. There wasn't much connecting them other than the person creating them. That was a problem. At least Brian decided it was a problem. He could have simply uploaded everything together. Instead, he started creating identities. Country Scars became one of them. The idea was fairly simple. There were songs Brian was writing that belonged together. They shared something. Not necessarily the exact same sound, but the same kind of emotional weight. They were songs about relationships, loss, regret, starting over, missing somebody you probably shouldn't miss anymore. Sometimes they were about things Brian had experienced. Sometimes they were inspired by an emotion he'd experienced but told through a completely different story. Sometimes they were simply stories. That distinction would become increasingly important as he created more. A song didn't have to be autobiographical, to be honest. You could invent two people who had never existed, put them in a situation that had never happened, and still write something that felt completely real. Brian liked that. It meant there were no limits. Country Scars gave those songs somewhere to belong. Then Brian created something that didn't belong there. Of course he did. So another identity was needed. Southern Sync. Then something else came along, FrankenFusion. Then Fifth Echo, Lightly Bruised, Personal Glowth. The names accumulated surprisingly quickly. From the outside, it might have looked like Brian had developed some elaborate strategy. Different artists, different genres, different audiences. Maybe there was a spreadsheet somewhere explaining how all of it connected. There wasn't. Brian had made music. The music didn't fit together, so he made different places to put it. That was pretty much the entire strategy. The process of creating the songs was changing too. Brian still recorded. Sometimes an idea started with him singing it. Sometimes he recorded music or vocals and used that as the foundation for what came next. Suno added another possibility. He could take something he'd recorded, import it, and start experimenting. A rough idea could become something much larger. A melody that existed only as a simple recording could suddenly have instruments around it. A song Brian could hear in his head could get considerably closer to the version he'd imagined. Other songs were created directly with the technology. It depended on the song. Brian wasn't particularly interested in establishing rules for himself. He was interested in the result. Did the song make him feel something? Did it sound like what he'd been trying to create? Would he actually want to listen to it if somebody else had made it? If the answer was yes, he kept going. If the answer was no, he tried again. Sometimes a lot. There was also something happening that Brian hadn't expected when he'd started. He was learning. Every song taught him something about writing the next one. A chorus could be technically fine and still not hit hard enough. A verse could contain good lines and still be too long. Sometimes the simplest line in the entire song was the one that mattered most. Sometimes he'd spend forever working on something complicated, only to discover that the part people remembered was 6 words he'd written without thinking much about them. Creating more made him better at creating, so he created more. That created another problem. There was now a lot of music. The little escape Brian had created for himself was consuming more and more of his free time. He didn't mind. Quite the opposite. He would think about songs during the day. Sometimes a title appeared first. That was enough. He'd put it into his phone before he forgot it. Later, he'd come back to it. What is this song actually about? Who is singing it? Who are they singing it to? What happened? Sometimes the answers came immediately. Sometimes a title sat there for weeks, waiting for Brian to figure out why he'd written it down in the first place. Then there were the songs that seemed to arrive almost finished. Those were nice. They were also considerably less common. Most required work. Brian didn't mind that either. The strange thing was that somewhere during all of this, the original reason for creating had started becoming less important. Music was still an escape. It was still healing. There were still songs Brian wrote because he needed somewhere to put an emotion. But now there were also songs he wrote simply because creating them was fun. That was new. He wasn't always trying to get away from something anymore. Sometimes he was trying to get toward something. He wanted to know what he could make. What happened if he combined this with that? What would this sound like as country? What if he went completely the other direction? Could he tell an entire story in 3.5 minutes? Could he make something funny? Could he make something that hurt? Could he make somebody he'd never met hear a song and think about their own life? He didn't know. There was really only one way to find out. Make it, upload it, see what happened. Most of the time, not much happened. That was the reality of it. Brian wasn't uploading songs and immediately watching thousands of people arrive. There were small numbers, sometimes very small numbers. A few views, a few more. Maybe somebody left a comment, maybe somebody subscribed. Then Brian uploaded another song. The channels were tiny. That didn't make the comments meaningless. Quite the opposite. These were strangers. Nobody had asked them to listen. Nobody had asked them to say something nice. Somebody somewhere had found something Brian created, listened to it, and decided it was worth spending another few seconds telling him they liked it. That was pretty cool. So Brian kept going. Country Scars in particular was starting to become something he enjoyed returning to. There was a freedom in writing for them. The songs could be vulnerable without becoming weak. They could tell stories. They could admit things people didn't always like admitting. Missing someone, being hurt, knowing a relationship was over while some part of you still hadn't accepted it. The kinds of things people often thought about when nobody else was around. Brian understood those songs, so he kept writing them. Then he wrote one called Used to Be Yours. There wasn't a meeting about it. No marketing department identified it as the song that should receive additional promotion. Nobody announced that Country Scars was about to have its first significant moment. It was another song. Brian created it, finished it, uploaded it, then he moved on to whatever he was working on next. At first, Used to Be Yours behaved like the others. A few people found it, then a few more. Nothing particularly unusual. Brian had other things to do, other songs to make, a job to go to, a life that still existed completely outside these little channels he was building in his spare time. So he wasn't sitting there staring at the number. Not constantly anyway. Then the number changed again. And again, more people were finding it. People Brian didn't know. Then more. Something was happening. It wasn't millions of people. It wasn't suddenly playing everywhere. Brian hadn't become famous overnight. The world continued functioning exactly as it had before. But Used to Be Yours wasn't behaving like the other songs. It was moving. For the first time, something Brian had created seemed to be traveling beyond the small circle he had built around it. People were finding Country Scars because of it. They were listening. Some stayed for another song. Some subscribed. Some commented. Brian watched the numbers climb and slowly realized that this was different. He had spent all this time creating because it helped him. Then because he enjoyed it. He'd created artists because the music needed somewhere to go. He'd created channels because the artists needed somewhere to live. Until now, most of that little world had existed largely because Brian wanted it to exist. Used to Be Yours was the first real indication that other people might want it to exist too. That mattered, probably more than the number itself, because for the first time, Brian had proof. Somebody was listening, and then a lot more somebodies started listening too.
We were electric, girl can't deny. Told me forever, fed me with lies. You moved in silence. I see why, made me feel like I was out of line. I gave you space, gave you time. Thought we were real, you crossed the line. It wasn't like that, please don't deny. I know that look, you're living a lie.
You hit me up like you missed my touch, but your words don't mean that much. You had gold, now it's turned to rust. So don't pretend it's still love.
Now you're crying like I'm still yours.
But you were gone before you closed the door.
You say you didn't mean to let it fall, but girl, I ain't trying to feel the pain no more.
You broke what we had, now you want it restored. But it's too late, I ain't yours no more. You say made your bed, now you're dreaming regret. Talking about chances you never could get. Told your friends that I did you wrong, but your truth don't match your text. Now you're spinning back around, acting like we're still us somehow. But my heart's not a playground, and I ain't backing down. You hit me up like you missed my face, but baby, that love's been replaced. Should've held me down, kept me safe. Instead you just drifted away. Now you're crying like I'm still yours, but you were gone before you closed the door. You say you didn't mean to let it fall, but girl, I ain't trying to feel the pain no more. You broke what we had, now you want it restored, but it's too late, I ain't yours no more. You say you miss what we were before, but I ain't who I was when I used to be yours. Now you want back what you pushed aside, but this heart's got a brand new vibe. You thought I'd wait, but I learned to fly. Now you're just a name I'll leave behind. Now you're crying like I'm still yours, but you were gone before you closed the door. You say you didn't mean to let it fall, but girl, I ain't trying to feel that pain no more. You broke what we had, now you want it restored, but it's too late, I ain't yours no more. You say you miss what we were before, but I ain't who I was when I used to be
Part 3. Somebody was listening. Used to be yours kept moving. Brian checked it before work. More views. He checked it later. More. Then again. Still moving. It wasn't viral in the way people usually use that word. There weren't millions of views appearing overnight. Nobody from a record company was calling. Brian wasn't being recognized at the grocery store. It was considerably smaller than that. But compared to what Brian was used to seeing, it felt enormous. Country Scars was still a tiny project. Most of the channels were. Brian could upload something he had spent hours creating and watch it collect a handful of views, sometimes a very small handful. That was normal. Then Used to Be Yours came along and apparently didn't understand how things were supposed to work. People kept finding it. More importantly, some of them stayed. They listened to another Country Scars song, then another. Some subscribed. Some left comments. Some came back. Brian started recognizing names. That was strange. These weren't friends supporting something Brian had made because they knew him. They didn't know him. They weren't coworkers. They weren't relatives. They weren't people Brian had cornered somewhere and forced to listen to his new song while politely preventing them from escaping. They were strangers. They had millions of other things they could have been listening to. They chose this. That changed something for Brian. Until then, success had mostly meant finishing something. Write the song, create the music, listen to it, decide whether it worked, upload it, move on. The reward was creation itself. Now there was something on the other side, an audience, a small one, but real. Brian didn't suddenly start planning his retirement. YouTube wasn't paying his bills. Country Scars wasn't paying his bills. None of the music was paying his bills. The good-paying job was still doing that. So Brian continued going to work. That part of his life remained almost completely unchanged. Wake up, go to work, come home, create. Except now there was occasionally something waiting for him when he got home. A new comment, another subscriber, more views than there had been that morning. Somebody saying the song reminded them of something they'd gone through. Somebody saying they'd listened more than once. That part mattered. Brian had written music because he needed somewhere to put things he was carrying. Now people were hearing those songs and putting their own experiences into them. The song didn't belong entirely to him anymore. That was probably the first time Brian really understood what could happen when you put something creative into the world. You knew what it meant when you made it. You didn't get to decide what it meant to everybody else. Someone could hear a relationship song and think about a person they hadn't seen in 20 years. Someone else could hear the exact same song and think about someone sitting in the next room. Another person might just like the chorus. All of those people were hearing the same recording. They weren't hearing the same song. Brian liked that. It made him want to write better ones. It also made him want to create more of them, which was convenient because apparently he wasn't having any difficulty coming up with ideas. The channels continued growing, slowly, some considerably more slowly than others. Country Scars had momentum now, but that didn't mean everything Brian uploaded suddenly worked. Some songs did well, some didn't. Some Brian thought were among the best things he'd written barely moved. Others surprised him. That would become a familiar experience. Brian was beginning to learn something about audiences. They didn't care which song you thought should be popular. They would make that decision themselves. There wasn't much point arguing with them, so Brian didn't. He kept creating. Country Scars became more defined with every song. So did the other projects. Southern Sync had its place. FrankenFusion had its place. Fifth Echo had its place. Lightly Bruised had its place. Personal Glowth had its place. Brian was gradually building separate little worlds around different kinds of music. The problem was that Brian's brain hadn't agreed to remain inside any of them. He kept having ideas that didn't fit. A song would come together and Brian would immediately know what it wasn't. Not Country Scars. Not Southern Sync, not FrankenFusion. He would go through the growing collection of places he'd created and occasionally reach the same conclusion. None of them. He had created all these different places so he wouldn't have to force music somewhere it didn't belong. Now he was running out of places again. There was another problem too. Brian was becoming increasingly interested in styles of music that weren't represented by any of his existing projects. One of those sounds came from something he'd loved for years. Late 90s and early 2000s vocal pop, the big harmonies, emotional choruses, multiple male voices coming together and making a chorus feel considerably larger than the verses around it. The kind of music groups like 98 Degrees had been known for. Brian wanted to make some. There wasn't a particularly complicated reason. He liked it. That was enough. Except where was he supposed to put it? It didn't belong on Country Scars, that much was obvious. It didn't really belong anywhere else either. Brian had somehow created several different music identities and still managed to make music that didn't fit any of them. There was probably a lesson in there about his inability to stay inside a category. Brian chose not to learn it. Instead, he created another place. Brian Bailey Music Productions. The name made it sound considerably more organized than it actually was. There wasn't an office. There wasn't a staff. There wasn't a conference room where executives discussed the next quarter. There was Brian. There was a computer. There were a ridiculous number of ideas. That was the production company. At first, Brian Bailey Music Productions served a very practical purpose. It was somewhere to put things. If Brian made something he liked and it didn't belong anywhere else, BBMP could take it. There was no established sound to violate, no fictional artist identity to worry about, no audience expecting one particular thing. It was open. That freedom immediately became useful. Brian started making the music he'd wanted to make, including those 98 Degrees style songs, big harmonies, emotional lyrics, pop production, songs that weren't trying to be Country Scars or anything else he'd already created. They were simply things Brian wanted to hear. So he made them. Then something familiar started happening. People listened. Not huge numbers at first, but the channel started moving. Brian uploaded another, then another. The songs began finding people. Subscribers started appearing. Brian Bailey Music Productions was supposed to be the miscellaneous channel, the place for everything that didn't have another home. Instead, it was slowly becoming one of the things pulling everything forward. That was unexpected. It was also important. Used to Be Yours had shown Brian that a song could escape the little world where he'd created it. People could find something without knowing who he was. They could connect with it. They could come back. The 98 Degrees style songs were teaching him something different. He didn't have to predict what people wanted before creating it. He could make something because he wanted it to exist. Then put it out there. Maybe nobody would care. That was always possible. Or maybe there were other people who had been waiting to hear something like it too. Brian couldn't know until he made it. So he stopped worrying quite so much about where ideas belonged. If something fit Country Scars, it went to Country Scars. If it fit one of the other artists, it went there. And if it didn't fit anywhere, that wasn't really a problem anymore. Brian Bailey Music Productions had become the place where Brian could create whatever he wanted. He didn't understand how important that would eventually become. Not yet. He was still working his regular job, still creating around everything else in his life, still thinking mostly in terms of songs and channels. He hadn't started thinking about books, or audiobooks, or movie stories, or clothing, or building his own entertainment platform. Those things were still somewhere ahead of him. For now, something much simpler was happening. The thing Brian had originally started as an escape was beginning to grow. People were listening, and Brian was beginning to wonder how far he could take it. Part 4. Better Than Before. By late December, Brian Bailey Music Productions had started to find a few people. Not a lot of people. There was no sudden explosion in views. No moment where Brian woke up, checked the channel, and discovered that everything had changed overnight. It was smaller than that. Better Than Before was one of the songs that helped. Along with about half a dozen other songs Brian had created in that same 98 Degrees inspired style, it started bringing a little attention to the channel.
I've walked through storms I shouldn't have survived, lost my way 1,000 times, but somehow love pulled me through. Every lesson led to you. Now every scar I used to hide feels like proof that I'm alive. I was broken, but you saw more. Turned my silence into song once more. You made me better than before. Gave my heart a reason to soar. You took the pieces I left behind and built a stronger love this time. Till you made me better than before. You showed me grace in every fall, found the beauty in it all. Now every tear that used to burn feels like the way my soul has learned. The past don't own me anymore. You're the peace I'm living for. Every wrong became the door that led me right to something more. till you made me better than before. Better than before. You made me better than before.
A few more views, a few more subscribers, a few people coming back. That was about it. It wasn't enough to change Brian's life. It wasn't even enough to change his day. He still went to work, still paid the bills the same way he always had, still created music whenever he could find the time. But Brian Bailey Music Productions wasn't completely invisible anymore. There were people out there listening, not thousands waiting for every upload, just people. A small audience. And strangely enough, that little bit of attention didn't disappear. It continued, not dramatically. It didn't suddenly multiply into something enormous. It just stayed. Weeks passed, then months. Brian kept uploading, and that small audience remained. Even much later, the attention those songs helped create was still there. There was something encouraging about that. Brian had spent most of this journey creating without knowing whether anybody would ever care. Now he knew at least some people did. Better Than Before also represented something else. Brian had made it because he liked that kind of music. That was it. There hadn't been an audience demanding it. Nobody had told him that late 90s and early 2000s vocal pop was the brilliant strategic direction Brian Bailey Music Productions needed to take. Brian liked big harmonies. He liked emotional songs. He liked the sound groups like 98 Degrees had created. So he made his version of it. Then he made another, and another. Eventually, there were about half a dozen of them sitting there, doing something none of Brian's careful planning could have predicted. Finding people. It reinforced something Brian was already beginning to understand. Maybe he didn't need to decide what he was allowed to create. Maybe the entire point of Brian Bailey Music Productions was that there wasn't an answer to that question. If Brian wanted to make country, he could. If he wanted pop, he could. If tomorrow he wanted to create something completely different, there was nothing stopping him. That freedom was becoming increasingly important. Because Brian's ambitions were changing again. For all the artists he'd created and all the technology he was experimenting with, there was still another voice Brian wanted people to hear. His. Brian had recorded music before. His own recordings had been part of the journey from the beginning. Sometimes those recordings became starting points for something larger. Sometimes they remained much closer to what he'd originally performed. But releasing an entire album featuring his own voice was different. That wasn't creating another artist. There wasn't another name standing between Brian and the music. This one would be his. In April, Brian released I Knew It Would Go This Way, his first album featuring his own voice.
It was all there from the start. You said forever like it didn't weigh much, like it was something you could say for the rush. I remember thinking that don't sound right, but I let it sit, didn't pick that fight. There were little signs in the way you'd move, say one thing and do what you choose. I was watching it all quiet in my head, already seeing where it was headed. I could feel it slipping through my hands before it ever had a chance to land. I knew it would go this way before it ever got too far. Heard it in the things you'd say, felt it in your guarded heart. I wasn't blind, I just stayed, hoping you might prove me wrong. But deep down I always knew this wasn't where you'd belong. Yeah, I knew it would go this way. You called it love, but it felt like space, like I was standing in a temporary place. Every time I tried to meet you halfway, you take a step back, drift the other way. I don't hate you, I just see it clear. You weren't ready for something real here, and I won't pretend like I didn't know. I felt it early, just didn't let go. I could feel it slipping through my hands before we ever had a chance to stand. I knew it would go this way before it ever got too far. Heard it in the things you'd say, felt it in your guarded heart. I wasn't blind, I just stayed hoping you might prove me wrong. But deep down I always knew this wasn't where you'd belong. Yeah, I knew it would go this way. I gave it time, I gave it space. Even when I saw the cracks in place, I wasn't lost, I just believed maybe you'd become what you couldn't be. I knew it would go this way before it ever got too far. Heard it in the things you'd say, felt it in your guarded heart. I wasn't blind, I just stayed hoping you might prove me wrong. But deep down I always knew this wasn't where you'd belong. I knew it would go this way. I knew it would go this way. It was all there from the start. I just hoped I was wrong.
It was a different kind of milestone. There didn't need to be a viral song attached to it. There didn't need to be a giant audience waiting. Brian had taken something he'd been doing privately, something that had existed through recordings and experiments and countless hours of creating, and turned it into an album. His album, his voice, his name. There was something satisfying about seeing it finished. Not because it proved Brian was about to become a famous singer. That wasn't what this journey had ever been about. It proved he could finish the thing. There had been a time when Brian was simply writing songs because writing them made difficult days easier. Now there was an album, an actual collection of music that hadn't existed until he decided to create it. He could look at I Knew It Would Go This Way and trace a line backward, back through Brian Bailey Music Productions, back through Country Scars and the other artists, back through the experiments with Suno, back through his own recordings, back to sitting down after work and putting words on a screen because he needed somewhere for them to go. That line was getting longer. Brian didn't stop to admire it for very long. There was more music to make. There was always more music to make. By June, there was another album, The Rescue Addiction, his second. That changed the meaning of the first one a little. I Knew It Would Go This Way could have been something Brian tried once. A project, something to check off the list. The Rescue Addiction made it clear that wasn't what had happened. Brian was continuing, the music was continuing, and everything was continuing. And by then, the amount of creative work surrounding him was becoming a little ridiculous. There were different artists, different channels, his own music, songs created from his recordings, songs developed with Suno, songs created using completely different approaches, ideas sitting unfinished, finished songs waiting to be uploaded, new ideas arriving before the old ones were done. Brian could finish one thing and somehow end the day with more things to do than he'd started with. He was beginning to discover one of the less convenient characteristics of creativity. Creating something usually gave him ideas for 3 more things. There was no finish line. There was just the next thing. The small audience around Brian Bailey Music Productions continued to exist. Country Scars continued. The other artists continued. Brian continued releasing his own work. None of it had transformed into some enormous entertainment company. Not yet. From the outside, Brian still had a regular job and a collection of creative projects he worked on around it. That description was technically accurate. It was also becoming increasingly misleading. Because the job might have been where Brian spent a large part of his day, but it wasn't where his mind was going anymore. He thought about songs. He thought about videos. He thought about what else he could create. He was beginning to think beyond music, too. Stories had always interested him, So had books. So had the idea of taking something that existed only in his imagination and finding a way to make other people see it. Music had shown him that technology could help close the distance between an idea and a finished creation. That raised an obvious question. What else could he do with it? Brian had already created more music channels than he'd ever intended to create. He'd released 2 albums featuring his own voice. He had fictional artists, real recordings, songs finding audiences he had never met. Brian Bailey Music Productions had gone from somewhere to put the music that didn't fit anywhere else to a place where Brian didn't have to worry about fitting at all. That was changing the way he thought. He wasn't asking himself what kind of musician he was anymore. He wasn't even sure musician was a big enough description for what he wanted to do. There were other things he wanted to make: videos, stories, books, characters, entire worlds if he could figure out how. The music had started as an escape. Then it became a way of healing. Then it became something Brian genuinely loved doing. Now it was doing something else. It was teaching him that an idea didn't have to stay an idea. You could make it real. And Brian had a lot more ideas.
I used to think love meant carrying weight, showing up whenever somebody couldn't, giving my heart till there was nothing left, calling it strength when I shouldn't. I'd see the cracks and run toward the fall, try to be the answer to it all. Every broken soul felt like a sign that somehow they were mine. I wasn't chasing them, I was chasing who I thought I'd be, the hero in the story. Everybody needed me. It was the rescue addiction, the feeling that I had to stay, the belief that if I loved enough I could somehow change their way. I confused being needed with being loved and understood. The rescue addiction had me giving more than I should. Everyone looked like a challenge, every red flag looked like a test. Everybody told me I was drowning, but I called it doing my best. I wore exhaustion like a badge, convinced myself it made me strong, never asking why I kept choosing where I didn't belong. I wasn't chasing them, I was chasing who I thought I'd be, the hero in the story. Everybody needed me. It was the rescue addiction, the feeling that I had to stay, the belief that if I loved enough I could somehow change their way. I confused being needed with being loved and understood. The rescue addiction had me giving more than I should. Maybe love was never meant to be a battlefield to win. Maybe healthy doesn't feel exciting when chaos is all you've been in. Maybe the hardest thing to learn is not everybody needs your hand. Sometimes the strongest thing you'll do is let somebody make their own stand. It was the rescue addiction, the thing I finally had to face. I spent years trying to save the world while losing myself in the chase. And now I know the difference between helping and self-destruction. I broke the cycle and I named it the rescue addiction. I thought I was saving them, but I was the one who needed rescuing.
Part 5. Apparently, music wasn't enough. At some point, Brian made a fairly predictable discovery. Music wasn't going to be enough. Not because he was losing interest in it. The opposite was happening. Creating music had changed the way he looked at ideas. Before all of this, an idea could simply be an idea. Something interesting to think about. Maybe something he'd get around to eventually. Now Brian had spent enough time turning ideas into actual things that someday was becoming considerably less satisfying. If he could think of something, he wanted to see what happened if he made it. That was becoming a problem. Mostly because Brian thought of a lot of things. He wanted to create videos, not just music videos. Stories, characters, things that were funny, things that were serious, things that might not make sense beside anything else he'd already created. That last part wasn't exactly unfamiliar territory. Brian had already solved that problem with music. Make somewhere else to put it. So he created Brian Bailey Creative on Facebook and TikTok. The name was intentionally broad. There was a reason for that. Brian had learned his lesson. Calling something by one specific genre was basically guaranteeing he'd create something completely different 2 days later. Brian Bailey Creative could be whatever it needed to be. Videos could go there, ideas could go there, experiments could go there. If Brian made something and wasn't entirely sure what it was, that was probably fine too. The important part was that he now had somewhere to put it. Then there were the books. Brian had wanted to write books. That idea wasn't new. Actually doing it was. Writing a song and writing a book were very different experiences. A song could start with one emotion, one moment, one idea. A few minutes later, the listener had experienced the entire thing. A book didn't work that way. There were characters, continuity, locations, timelines. People had to remember what they had done 3 chapters earlier. Apparently, readers noticed when they didn't. He started out not so great at that, so he learned that editing takes twice as long as writing the book itself. More time. Brian started building stories, not songs that told stories, actual stories, long ones. Characters could exist for hours instead of minutes. They could make mistakes, learn things, meet people, lose people, get themselves into situations Brian wasn't entirely sure how he was going to get them out of yet. That was part of the fun. Brian Bailey Author became the home for that side of him, another channel, another project. Another thing requiring time Brian didn't technically have. Brian created it anyway. By this point, there was a pattern. Brian didn't really decide to expand. He created something that needed somewhere to exist. Then he built somewhere for it. The Litterbox Fight Club came from another direction entirely, then Ninja Kittens. Because apparently books and music still hadn't created enough things for Brian to keep track of. The strange part was that none of it felt completely separate to him. To somebody looking at the channels from the outside, it probably did. A country music project had very little obvious connection to a kitten video. A pop song didn't necessarily belong beside an audiobook. A serious story could exist in a completely different universe from something Brian had created because he thought it was funny. To Brian, the connection was obvious. He made them. That was enough. The same curiosity sat behind all of it. What happens if I try this? Sometimes the answer was something good. Sometimes the answer was that Brian probably shouldn't do that again. Both answers were useful. Meanwhile, the music refused to slow down. Brian kept writing. And once again, he kept making things that didn't fit anywhere he'd already created. By this point, he had enough artist identities that this really shouldn't have been possible. He managed it anyway. Lady Country gave another kind of song somewhere to live. New Imaginations opened another direction. Rapsy appeared when Brian wanted to explore something different again. Ashlyn followed. FaithMix. Every new artist had a reason to exist. Not necessarily a reason Brian had known before creating the music. Usually the process happened backward. Create something. Listen to it. Realize it doesn't belong anywhere. Apparently create another artist. It wasn't the most efficient system. It was working. Then Brian's interest in stories started colliding with his interest in music. He wasn't only thinking about individual songs anymore. He was thinking cinematically. What would this scene sound like? What kind of music belongs behind this moment? Could music help tell a larger story? Could Brian create something that felt like it belonged in a movie, even if the movie didn't exist? Brian Bailey's Cinematic Music Hub grew from that experimentation. Another channel, another direction, another piece of a creative world Brian still wasn't entirely aware he was building. Think for Yourself Music eventually joined it. Then Brianna Phillips. The list was getting long. There were moments when Brian would look at everything and realize just how much he'd created. Country Scars, Southern Sync, FrankenFusion, Fifth Echo, Lightly Bruised, Personal Glowth, Brian Bailey Music Productions, Lady Country, New Imaginations, B. Rapsy, Ashland, FaithMix, Brian Bailey Cinematic Music Hub, Think for Yourself Music, Brianna Phillips. Then there was Brian Bailey Creative, Brian Bailey Author, The Litterbox Fight Club, Ninja Kittens, Brian himself. And technically, he has a Country Scars Facebook page and 2 Instagrams that don't really get much attention. It had started with writing songs after work. That fact was becoming increasingly difficult to believe. The original escape was now spread across music, video, books, stories, characters, and ideas Brian hadn't even figured out how to create yet. The funny thing was that his regular life still existed around all of it. Brian still had a job, a good-paying one. He still had responsibilities. He still needed the paycheck. Creating had to fit into whatever pieces of time remained. Before work, after work, days off, evenings, weekends. Whenever there was an opening, Brian used it. Sometimes that meant working on something when he probably should have been resting. Sometimes it meant having an idea at an inconvenient time and writing enough of it down that he could find it again later. Sometimes it meant looking at the clock and realizing that "I'll work on this for 20 minutes" had apparently occurred several hours earlier. The creative work kept expanding. The available time didn't. That created tension Brian couldn't ignore forever. Something else had changed, too. The music wasn't functioning primarily as an escape anymore. It had done its job. It had helped him through a period when he needed somewhere else to put his attention. It had given him somewhere to put emotions. It had helped him heal. But Brian wasn't creating only because he needed relief anymore. He was creating because he loved creating. There was a significant difference between those things. He wasn't running away. He was moving toward something. He just didn't know exactly what that something was yet. There was no business plan explaining where Brian Bailey Music Productions would be in 5 years. No roadmap showing how all the channels connected. No guarantee any of it would ever become financially sustainable. Brian didn't even know whether most of the things he was creating would find an audience. He knew something simpler. He wanted to keep doing it. The job paid him. Creating fulfilled him. For a while, those two things existed beside each other. One provided the money that made life possible. The other increasingly became the reason Brian wanted more time. Eventually, he started noticing something. When he imagined his future, he wasn't thinking about where the job might take him. He was thinking about this: the music, the books, the stories, the channels, the things he hadn't created yet. Brian still went to work. He still did what he was supposed to do. He still collected the paycheck. But mentally, something had already shifted. He hadn't left his old life. Not technically, but he was already building the next one.
I spent years trying to make my life look beautiful, even when it didn't feel beautiful at all. I used to think I had to hold it all. Never crack, never break, never fall. Hair done, smile on, keep it together, even when my whole world felt heavy as ever. I chased love that looked good on paper, chased people I thought might save me later. Worked so hard trying to earn my worth, till I forgot I already had it from birth. And somewhere between all the pressure and pain, I stopped feeling like myself again. Turns out perfect comes with a price, and lately I don't think it's worth my life. I don't want perfect anymore. I don't want to cry behind closed doors, trying to keep up with impossible things while my soul slowly breaks underneath. I still want love, still want dreams, still want somebody who chooses me. I just don't want to hate myself, trying to be somebody else anymore. Now I leave some messes where they land. Some nights I just need quiet instead. Stopped saying yes when my heart said no. Stop forcing things I should've let go. And honestly, life feels softer these days since I stopped treating myself that way. I laugh more now, breathe more now, care a little less what people think somehow. Turns out peace ain't giving up, it's finally knowing when enough is enough. And maybe strength ain't pushing till you break. Maybe it's learning what's yours to take. I don't want perfect anymore. I don't want to cry behind closed doors, trying to keep up with impossible things while my soul slowly breaks underneath. I still want love, still want dreams, still want somebody who chooses me. I just don't want to hate myself, trying to be somebody else anymore. Maybe the strongest thing I ever did was finally stop pretending that I was okay all the time. I don't want perfect anymore. I want mornings that feel peaceful at the core. I want love that feels safe and real, not something I constantly have to heal. I still believe in beautiful things, still believe life can change everything. I just know now my heart deserves more than chasing perfect anymore. Yeah, I finally know what matters now.
Part 6. 2 Lives. For a while, Brian lived 2 lives. There was the one that paid him. Then there was the one he was building. The first one was easy to explain. He had a job. He went to work. He earned a paycheck. The second one required considerably more explanation. There was music. A lot of music. There were multiple artists, each with their own channels and identities. There was Brian Bailey Music Productions. There were his own albums. There were books. Audiobooks were becoming part of the plan. There were videos, stories, characters. Brian Bailey Creative. Brian Bailey Author. There were ideas that had already become real and considerably more that were waiting for Brian to find enough time to get to them. That was becoming the problem. Time. Brian could make more money. He could create more channels. He could write more songs. There wasn't much he could do about the fact that a day continued to contain 24 hours. He checked. Apparently that rule applied to everybody, so he used the hours he had. If there was time before work, he created. If there was time after work, he created. He would wake up in the middle of the night to take notes after creating something in his dreams. Days off became opportunities to work on larger things. A song might get finished, a story might move forward, an upload might finally get done. Then there were thumbnails, descriptions, audio, editing, and all the other little jobs that came with putting something into the world. Creating the thing was only part of creating the thing. Brian was learning that. Finishing a song didn't mean the work was finished. Finishing a book definitely didn't mean the work was finished. Everything created another list of things that needed to happen afterward. Brian kept doing them. The strange part was that he didn't really mind. He could spend hours working on something and still want to see what happened when it was finished. That wasn't how he felt about everything in his life. The difference was becoming increasingly obvious. His job still mattered. It provided something the creative work couldn't reliably provide. Money. That wasn't a minor detail. Passion was useful. Landlords had traditionally preferred currency. So Brian continued working. He wasn't under the illusion that wanting to become a full-time creator automatically made it financially possible. YouTube didn't care how badly he wanted it. Neither did the power company. The numbers were what they were. Country Scars had experienced moments of attention. Used to Be Yours had shown Brian that one of his songs could travel farther than he expected. Brian Bailey Music Productions had developed its small audience after Better Than Before, and those other 98 Degrees style songs started finding people. That audience was still there. But none of it was replacing a good-paying job. Not even close. Not a cent from any of it. Brian knew that. He kept building anyway. Something had changed in the way he thought about his job, too. There had been a time when it represented his future, a career, something stable, something he was supposed to keep doing because that was what responsible adults did when they had a job that paid well. By now, Brian didn't really see it that way anymore. It was income, important income, necessary income. But when he thought about where he wanted his life to go, he wasn't thinking about the next position. He wasn't imagining another 10 years doing the same thing. He was thinking about what he could build if he had more time. That thought followed him around. What could he do with 40 more hours every week? How many songs? How many books? How much better could the channels become if he wasn't squeezing them into whatever pieces of the day remained? What could Brian Bailey Music Productions actually become if it wasn't being built around another career? There was no answer. Brian didn't have the money to find out. So the two lives continued. Work provided the resources. Creating provided the direction. Brian had already moved on in his mind. That didn't mean he stopped doing his job. It meant the job was no longer where he saw himself going. There was a difference. His future was somewhere else. He could see pieces of it every time he opened YouTube, every time someone listened to a Country Scars song, every time somebody found one of the 98 Degrees style songs on Brian Bailey Music Productions. Every time he looked at I Knew It Would Go This Way or The Rescue Addiction and remembered that those albums hadn't existed until he made them. Every time he worked on a story. Every time another idea became something real. None of those things were individually large enough to replace his income. Together, though, they were beginning to look like a direction. Brian didn't know how long it would take. He didn't know whether one channel would eventually grow or whether several would. Maybe music would do it. Maybe books would. Maybe something Brian hadn't even created yet would become the thing that changed everything. He couldn't know, so he kept building. Then one day, the two lives stopped existing beside each other. Brian was let go from his job. There was no dramatic scene, no speech, no cinematic moment where Brian stood up, said exactly what he'd been waiting years to say, and walked through the doors while inspirational music played. Real life usually isn't that cooperative. The job simply ended, and he said, okay. He knew where he was supposed to be going. The only problem was, with the job went the paycheck. That part was real. Whatever Brian thought about his future, money still mattered. He had bills, he had expenses, he had projects that cost money to create. The thing that had financially supported everything he was building was suddenly gone. For a lot of people, that would have created an immediate question. What now? Brian didn't really have that question. He had already answered it. Months earlier, maybe longer. He had answered it every time he chose to spend another evening creating. Every time he wrote another song. Every time he opened another channel. Every time he worked on another story. Every time he imagined what he could build if he ever had enough time. Brian had already left in his mind. Now the rest of his life had caught up. That didn't make the situation safe. It didn't make it financially responsible. It didn't magically make the YouTube numbers larger. Brian Bailey Music Productions still had its small audience. The books were still being built. Country Scars was still growing one listener at a time. Nothing changed simply because Brian suddenly needed it to. Except one thing. Time. For the first time since this entire journey had started, Brian had it. The 40 hours he'd spent working every week were suddenly his. The hours around those 40 were his too. There was no job to build everything around anymore. There was no waiting until after work, no trying to squeeze a project into a day off, no looking at something he desperately wanted to finish and realizing he had to stop because he needed to get some sleep before morning. Brian finally had the thing he'd spent months wondering about. Time. There was just one unfortunate condition attached to it. He needed to make it work because this time had an expiration date. If he can't make it work in less than a year, he had to go back to work. The safe thing would have been obvious. Find another job. Find another paycheck. Put the creative work back where it had been. Evenings, weekends, days off. Maybe Brian would eventually reach the point where the numbers made leaving safe. Maybe someday. Brian had spent enough of his life thinking about someday. He looked at everything he'd already built. The music, the artists, the albums, the channels, the books, the stories. None of it was large enough yet, but it was real. And for the first time, Brian didn't have to wonder what he could accomplish if he gave it everything. He could find out. There was no dramatic declaration, no inspirational speech. Brian didn't need one. The decision had already been made long before the job ended. Now there was only one thing left to do: make it work.
I put my life in every line, every scar, every sleepless night. Mixed it right, yeah, I did my part. Gave it true, straight from the heart.
They say play the game, I tried that too. Checked every box they told me to, but it disappears before it starts, like nobody ever hears that part.
They don't feel what's in these words. Don't know what it takes just to be heard.
All it takes is one quick scroll, and it never hits their soul.
The algorithm don't have a heart.
Don't know pain, don't know scars. Don't hear truth in the melody. Don't feel what this means to me. Don't care how many could be helped. If they never click it for themselves, it just counts if they click or stay. If they swipe it all away,
yeah, it's judging from the start.
but the algorithm don't have a heart.
But I've seen one message change my day.
Man, this song helped me find my way.
Yeah, by right there's more than numbers climbing, more than trends and perfect timing.
If it finds one soul in the dark, then it hit exactly where it marks.
Even if the world don't ever see
what this song could really be. I ain't here just to win that game. I'm here so somebody feels less pain. Even if it's quiet in the crowd, I'll still sing it loud. The algorithm don't have a heart. Don't know pain, don't know scars. Don't hear truth in the melody. Don't feel what this means to me. Don't care how many could be helped. If they never click it for themselves, it just counts if they click or stay. If they swipe it all away,
yeah, it's broken from the start.
'cause the algorithm don't have a heart.
Maybe one day it breaks through loud.
Maybe it don't reach that crowd,
but I didn't start this to chase a chart.
I started this from the heart.
The algorithm don't have a heart,
but I do, and that's my part.
Every word, every note I give,
it's for someone trying to live.
So if they find it when they need, then that's enough for me.
Yeah, I'll play my part,
even if it never has a heart.
It never had a heart,
but this right here,
that's where we start.
All in. For the first time, Brian woke up and didn't have somewhere else he needed to be. There was no shift starting, no commute, no clock telling him when somebody else owned the next 8 hours of his day. He had wanted more time. Now he had it. The circumstances weren't exactly how he would have chosen to get it, but the result was the same. Brian could create. So he did. There wasn't much of an adjustment period. He didn't take a few weeks off to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He already knew. There were songs waiting, books waiting, channels that needed attention, videos to make, audio to fix. Ideas Brian had been storing because there hadn't been enough hours to do anything with them. Now there were hours, a lot of them. Brian started using them. This was the part of becoming a full-time creator that didn't look particularly impressive from the outside. There was no studio full of employees, no assistant organizing his schedule, no editor waiting for the next manuscript, no production team, no marketing department. There was Brian, still one person. Except now, all the jobs belonged to him. He wrote the songs, he worked on the music, he recorded, he experimented with Suno. He listened, changed things, listened again, sometimes changed them back. He created the artwork, prepared the uploads, wrote descriptions, managed the channels, checked the analytics, answered comments. Then there were the books. Writing was only the beginning. A story had to work. Characters had to remain the same people from one chapter to the next. Details mattered. If somebody had a gun in one chapter, it couldn't magically belong to someone else 3 chapters later. If a character had already learned something, they couldn't conveniently forget it because the next scene worked better that way. Brian discovered that fictional people required a surprising amount of supervision. Then, the written story had to become audio. That created another collection of jobs. Listen, find mistakes, fix them. Listen again. Find the mistake that somehow survived the first time. Fix that one. Listen again. At some point, Brian began to suspect mistakes reproduced when nobody was watching. Then there were thumbnails, titles, descriptions, uploads, playlists, channel organization, more comments, more analytics. And while Brian was doing all of that, he was still creating music. The artists hadn't disappeared because Brian Bailey Author existed now. Country Scars still needed songs. Brian Bailey Music Productions still needed music. The other artists still existed. Brian still had ideas for all of them. The difference was that he could finally follow those ideas when they arrived. If he woke up with a song in his head, he could work on it. If a story was moving well, he didn't necessarily have to stop because he had somewhere else to be. He could keep going. That freedom increased Brian's output almost immediately. It also created a new problem. Brian could now work all day, so he did. Then sometimes he worked at night too. The line between work and everything else became difficult to locate. Technically, Brian had escaped having a job that controlled his schedule. He had replaced it with a boss who occasionally thought working until 2 in the morning was perfectly reasonable. Unfortunately, the boss was Brian. He wasn't particularly sympathetic. There was always another thing that could be done. Another song, another chapter, another upload, another thumbnail, another idea, another channel that hadn't received anything recently, another comment worth answering, another number worth checking even though Brian had checked it 15 minutes earlier and there was very little reason to believe civilization had dramatically changed since then. Full-time creation didn't feel like retirement. It felt like work, a lot of work. The difference was that Brian cared about it. That mattered. He could spend 10 hours on something and still want to know what happened when people finally heard it. Some days went well. Brian would finish a song he loved. A story would come together. An upload would start finding people. A comment would appear from somebody who connected with something he'd made. Those days made the whole thing feel possible. Other days were different. Brian could spend hours making something he thought was excellent, upload it, wait. Almost nobody cared. That happened. More than once. There was no manager to blame, no marketing department to yell at. The audience had simply decided they had other things to do. Brian learned to live with that. He had to. If every unsuccessful upload became a personal crisis, this wasn't going to work. So he started treating the failures the same way he'd treated his earliest songs. Make something. Learn something. Make something else. The strange part was that occasionally the opposite happened. Brian would create something without expecting much from it. Then people found it. The numbers moved. Someone shared it. Another person subscribed. Maybe an older upload suddenly started getting attention again. There wasn't always an obvious explanation. Brian was learning that YouTube had its own ideas about what Brian Bailey should be doing. It rarely shared those ideas with Brian in advance. So he experimented. Different music, different stories, different thumbnails, different formats. Some worked, some didn't. The important part was that Brian finally had enough time to find out. That was what he'd wanted when he still had the job. What could he accomplish if he gave this everything? Now he was getting the answer. More than he'd been able to accomplish before. Considerably more. But giving something everything didn't guarantee that it would immediately give anything back. That was the difficult part. Brian still needed money. The projects cost money. Subscriptions cost money. Software cost money. Creating and distributing things cost money. Life continued charging its usual fees regardless of whether Brian was pursuing something meaningful. There was pressure now that hadn't existed in quite the same way before. When Brian had the good-paying job, a song could fail, and it didn't really matter financially. He still got paid. Now every bit of growth mattered. Every subscriber mattered. Every view mattered. Every person who came back mattered. Brian needed the creative world he'd been building to become sustainable. Not because he wanted to become rich, because sustainability meant he could keep doing it. That became the goal. Make enough from the things Brian created to pay for Brian to continue creating them. It sounded simple when reduced to one sentence. Getting there was considerably less simple. So Brian worked. He wrote faster. He learned faster. He created more. The music continued. The books started becoming a much larger part of what he was doing. Brian Bailey Author began developing its own audience. People weren't only clicking on stories. They were staying, listening, sometimes for hours, then coming back for the next part. That was different from music. A song asked somebody for 3 or 4 minutes. A story could ask for an hour. A book could ask for many hours. People were giving Brian that time. That meant something. Comments started appearing from listeners invested in the characters. They had opinions, strong ones sometimes. They worried about fictional people Brian had invented. They got angry when those people made bad decisions. They wanted to know what happened next. Brian understood exactly how strange that was. He had typed these people into existence. Now strangers were concerned about them. That was pretty cool. It also showed Brian something. The music wasn't the only path forward. Maybe there wasn't one path. Maybe that had been the mistake in thinking about all of this. Brian Bailey Music Productions didn't have to become successful while everything else waited behind it. Country Scars could grow. Brian Bailey Author could grow. His own music could grow. A completely different project could suddenly find an audience. All of those little pieces could move independently while still contributing to the same larger thing. The thing Brian was building didn't need to be one channel. It didn't need to be one artist. It didn't even need to be music. That realization opened another door. Brian had started this journey by trying to escape for a few hours. Then he created music because it helped him heal. Eventually, he created because he loved doing it. Now, creation was also how he intended to build his future. There was considerably more pressure attached to it than there had been in the beginning. But there was also something Brian hadn't had before. A chance. Not a guarantee. A chance. He could wake up tomorrow and spend the day building something that belonged to him. Then he could do it again the day after that. If something failed, he could make something else. If something worked, he could build on it. And if he didn't know what would work? There was only one way Brian had ever figured that out. Create it. Put it out there. See what happens. So that was what he did, again and again and again. Brian was all in now. The music had once given him somewhere else to be. Now there wasn't anywhere else he wanted to go.
sun's down, but the fire's still burning. Every mile that we drive, my heart's still turning. Bare feet on the dash, girl, you got me grinning. Every look from your eyes feels like we're winning. We ain't playing safe, no breaks inside. Running red lights in the pale moonlight. I don't do halfway, I'm past that game. If I take the shot, I'm calling your name. Every beat of my chest says go, yeah, I'm letting it show. I'm all in, like the river runs deep, like the sky holds the stars that we keep. No maybe, no might, no second guess. Every breath, girl, I'm giving my best. I'm all in, with the night on our side, like the tide. I keep rolling in high if you're riding with me. It's true, I'm all in for you. Got that backbeat hitting with a little sway. Slide guitar crying while the hi-hats play. Your hand in mine's got me feeling reckless. Every kiss you give leaves me breathless. We're a front porch slow dance in a city skyline. Two worlds in a rhythm beating in time. I don't do halfway, I'm past that game. If I take the shot, I'm calling your name. Every beat of my chest says go, yeah, I'm letting it show. I'm all in, like the river runs deep, like the sky holds the stars that we keep. No maybe, no might, no second guess. Every breath, girl, I'm giving my best. I'm all in, with the night on our side, like the tide. I keep rolling in high if you're riding with me. It's true, I'm all in for you. No slowing down, we're burning bright. Burning bright tonight. Every turn we take just feels so right. Feels so right tonight. Let's tear the map up, baby. No plan in sight, just you and me riding into the night. I'm all in, like the river runs deep, like the sky holds the stars that we keep. No maybe, no might, no second guess. Every breath, girl, I'm giving my best. I'm all in, with the night on our side, like the tide. I keep rolling in high if you're riding with me. It's true, I'm all in for you. Yeah. I'm all in for you. No halfway, baby. All in.
Part 8. The stories start talking back. For most of the journey, music had been the center of everything. That made sense. Music was where Brian had started. It had been the escape, then the healing, then the experiment that somehow turned into country scars, Southern Sync, FrankenFusion, Fifth Echo, Lightly Bruised, Personal Glowth, and eventually Brian Bailey Music Productions. The books had arrived later. For a while, Brian Bailey, author, was simply another one of Brian's experiments, another place to put something he'd created. Then people started listening, not clicking, listening. There was a difference. A music video could get a view because somebody was curious about the thumbnail. They might listen for 30 seconds. Maybe they stayed for the whole song. Maybe they didn't. An audiobook asked for something considerably more valuable. Time. A lot of it. Someone could start one of Brian's stories and still be listening an hour later, then 2 hours, then longer. That was difficult for Brian to ignore. People were spending parts of their lives inside worlds he'd created. They listened while driving, while working, while cleaning, while relaxing at home. Sometimes they told Brian where they'd been listening. That made the numbers feel different. A watch time number on a screen was one thing. Realizing that somewhere a person had spent their afternoon listening to characters Brian had invented was something else entirely. Then they started talking about those characters. That was when things became strange. A listener would comment about a decision somebody had made in the story. Another would say they didn't trust someone. Someone else would be worried about what was going to happen next. Sometimes people disagreed with each other. Brian would read the comments and occasionally have to remind himself of one important fact. None of these people existed. He had made them up. Apparently nobody had informed the audience. The characters were real enough to them that their decisions mattered. That was exactly what Brian wanted. He had always liked storytelling. Music had already taught him how much could be done with a few minutes. A song could introduce two people, destroy their relationship, and leave one of them standing alone by the final chorus. A book gave Brian considerably more room to cause problems. He could build entire communities, put people into impossible situations, let relationships develop slowly, allow characters to change. He could introduce somebody in one chapter who seemed completely unimportant and make them essential later. He could create a world and then spend hours exploring what happened inside it. The more Brian wrote, the more he wanted to write. There was also a practical advantage. He had spent years thinking about stories. Now he finally had the tools to produce them in ways that would have been much more difficult before. Writing the book was one thing. Turning it into something people could listen to was another. Brian began creating audiobook versions. They weren't perfect. That bothered him. Artificial narration could mispronounce something. A sentence could have the wrong emotional inflection. A voice could suddenly decide a completely ordinary line needed to be delivered as though somebody had just discovered a body. Brian listened, fixed what he could, generated things again, listened again. There was always another error. Brian wanted the stories to sound as good as he could make them with the tools and resources he had available. He also knew what he eventually wanted: professional narrators, full video, not just an image sitting on a screen while the story played. Brian wanted people to be able to watch the worlds too, characters, locations, scenes, entire books turned into something closer to movies. There was only one minor problem. All of that cost money. Brian was becoming very familiar with that problem. The solution was the same as it had been everywhere else. Build what he could now, improve it when he could afford to, keep going. Brian Bailey author started growing, slowly at first, then faster. People found one story and moved to another. Some subscribed because they wanted the next chapter. Others discovered books that had already been completed and listened through them. The amount of time people were spending with Brian's work started climbing. Hours became hundreds of hours, then thousands. The scale was difficult to process. Brian could understand one person sitting somewhere listening to a story. He could understand 10. Looking at thousands of hours on a screen was different. Those weren't just views. That was time. Real, human time. People were giving it to something Brian had created. That mattered to him. It also created pressure. If somebody was willing to spend hours listening, Brian wanted the story to deserve those hours. So he kept working on the writing. He rewrote things, expanded things, corrected continuity, tried to make dialogue sound like actual people talking instead of characters explaining the plot to each other. He wanted people to behave like people, sometimes intelligently, sometimes stupidly, usually somewhere in between. He wanted humor where humor naturally existed, tension where tension belonged. He wanted the stories to feel lived in. The audience helped teach him. Comments showed Brian what people noticed. Sometimes listeners caught things he hadn't. Sometimes they interpreted a character differently than Brian expected. Sometimes they loved someone Brian hadn't intended to make particularly important. That was useful. Once something was released, Brian couldn't completely control how people experienced it. He was learning the same lesson he'd learned from music. You create it. Then it belongs partly to the people experiencing it. Country scars had taught him that. Now the books were teaching him again. And the two sides of Brian's creative world were starting to overlap. Music could belong to stories. Stories could inspire music. A fictional world could have its own soundtrack. A song could become part of something larger. Brian started experimenting with movie-style stories and cinematic music. That helped push Brian Bailey's Cinematic Music Hub into existence. Another piece, another direction, another idea that probably should have been enough to keep one person busy. Brian had several of those. Country Scars was changing too. It had started as somewhere for a particular kind of music to live. Over time, Brian began seeing more possibilities. The members had identities. The music had a recognizable emotional world around it. People knew the name. Brian started thinking beyond individual songs. What did Country Scars look like? What could the brand become? Could there be stories? Could there be merchandise? Could this fictional band exist as something larger than the music itself? That question would eventually lead Brian somewhere he hadn't expected. Again, by now, that was becoming normal. Every time Brian created something, it seemed to reveal three more things he could create. A song became an artist. An artist became a channel. A channel became an audience. A story became a book. A book became an audiobook. An audiobook created listeners who wanted another story. The pieces were beginning to connect. Brian Bailey Music Productions wasn't simply a YouTube channel anymore. Not in Brian's mind. Brian Bailey Author wasn't simply another channel either. Country Scars wasn't simply a collection of songs. They were becoming parts of something larger. Brian still didn't have a particularly good name for that larger thing. Creative Universe sounded a little dramatic. Entertainment Company sounded considerably more organized than the reality. The reality still involved one guy sitting at a computer trying to remember which of his many projects he was supposed to be working on. But something was definitely happening. People were listening to the music. People were listening to the books. Some were starting to follow the projects rather than individual uploads. They were coming back. That was the important part. Brian had spent so much of the early journey trying to find places for his creations to live. Now other people were starting to visit them. Some stayed, some returned. And the more Brian watched that happen, the more he started thinking about a question that would eventually become much bigger than another YouTube channel. If all of these things belonged to the same creative world, why were they scattered everywhere? The music was in one place. The books were somewhere else. Videos somewhere else. Merchandise would need somewhere else again. Every platform did one piece well. Brian wanted all the pieces. He didn't know how to build that yet. He definitely couldn't afford to build it yet. But that had never stopped him from thinking about something before. For now, there were stories to write, songs to create, audiobooks to finish, channels to grow. Brian had spent years creating places for his ideas to live. He was beginning to wonder what would happen if someday he built one place big enough for all of them. Part 9. What if it was all in one place? Brian had created a new problem. He had too much stuff. That probably wasn't the technical description of the problem, but it was accurate. There was music. A lot of music. There were artists. There were books, audiobooks, videos, stories, characters, different YouTube channels, different social media accounts, music on streaming services, books that could eventually be sold in different formats, ideas for things that didn't exist yet. Every time Brian expanded into something new, another platform seemed to become necessary. That bothered him. Not enough to stop creating. Very few things seemed capable of doing that, but enough to make him start thinking. The first major example was Country Scars. Country Scars had started as a name. The music needed somewhere to go, so Brian gave some of it an identity. Then he kept writing for that identity. Over time, Country Scars became more defined. It wasn't just a label Brian attached to random country songs anymore. There was a sound. There was an attitude. There were 3 members, Dan Jeffries, Phil O'Brien, Joe Raymond. They had personalities. They had a history. Brian knew how they should sound. He knew what kind of songs belonged to them and, equally important, what kind didn't. Something that had started as a practical solution had become a band, a fictional one. But that distinction was starting to become less important creatively. The music existed. People listened to it. People recognized the Country Scars name. Some came back specifically because that name was attached to the next song. That made Brian wonder what else Country Scars could become. Maybe one day he could make them real people. That was an interesting thought to him. For now, he kept going with what he had. So he designed clothing. Not one shirt with a logo slapped across the front. A clothing line. Different designs, different pieces. Something that could eventually exist beside the music instead of simply advertising it. Brian could see what he wanted it to become. There was, once again, a problem. Money. Brian was discovering that having ideas was considerably cheaper than manufacturing them. Still, the designs existed. That mattered. They could wait. Brian had become very comfortable building things in stages. If he couldn't do the final version today, he could build the part he could afford. Then keep going. That same thinking started applying to everything else. Brian looked at what he was creating and realized how fragmented it was. Someone could discover Country Scars on YouTube, then maybe find the music somewhere else. Someone else could discover Brian Bailey, author, and spend hours listening to a book without knowing Brian made music at all. Another person might find Brian Bailey creative on Facebook or TikTok. A person interested in merchandise would eventually need somewhere to buy it. Books had their own places. Music had its own places. Videos had theirs. Brian had spent years solving one problem by creating another place for something to live. Now he had so many places that he wanted to put them back together. That was when the idea for the platform started becoming more serious. Brian didn't want another website with a few links on it. He could already do that. He wanted something considerably bigger. A person should be able to arrive because they wanted to listen to a Country Scars song, then discover an album, maybe watch a video, maybe find one of Brian's books, listen to the audiobook without leaving, watch a story, find merchandise connected to the artist they liked, then discover another artist. Everything connected. One place. The easiest way Brian found to explain it was to borrow pieces from companies that already existed. Part Netflix, part Spotify, part Audible, part Shopify, except built around the things Brian was creating: music, audiobooks, video, stories, and merchandise. Eventually, maybe considerably more. Brian started designing it. He thought about how someone would move through it. What would they see when they arrived? How would the artists be organized? Where would the books go? How would someone move from listening to a story to finding something else connected to it? Could a person follow an artist? Could they build playlists? Could members get access to things without advertising? Could books, music, and video all exist under the same subscription? Could somebody listen in the car, then come home and continue watching something on a television? The idea kept getting larger. This was a familiar problem. Brian was very good at having ideas that created additional work for Brian. There was one major difference this time. He couldn't simply sit down and make the whole thing himself. A song was possible. A book was possible. A YouTube channel was possible. A full entertainment platform combining streaming music, audiobooks, video, and e-commerce was a slightly different project. It needed development, infrastructure, hosting, applications, payment systems, licensing considerations. People who knew considerably more about some of those things than Brian did. Most importantly, it needed money. A lot more money than Brian had, so the platform remained a design. For now, Brian didn't see that as failure. It simply meant he wasn't there yet. There had been a time when Country Scars didn't exist either. Brian Bailey Music Productions hadn't existed. Brian Bailey Author hadn't existed. I Knew It Would Go This Way had been an idea. The Rescue Addiction had been an idea. Every finished thing Brian could point to had spent some period of time existing only in his head. The platform was simply earlier in that process. Whether it ever made it through the expensive part remained to be seen. Brian wasn't pretending otherwise. There were things he wanted to build that he couldn't afford to build. There were improvements he wanted to make to the books. There were professional narrators he wanted to hire. There were full videos he wanted to create for the stories so people could watch them while they listened. There was Country Scars merchandise he wanted to make real. There was an entire platform waiting for resources Brian didn't have yet. That was where the audience became increasingly important. Not because Brian expected someone else to come along and pay for his dream, because growth created possibilities. A few more listeners meant a little more reach. More subscribers meant more people finding the next thing. More views meant more revenue. More revenue meant Brian could put more back into what he was creating. Better tools, better production, better narration, better videos. Eventually, maybe merchandise. Eventually, maybe the platform. That was the model Brian could see. Create something. Use whatever it earns to make the next thing better. Grow. Repeat. It wasn't fast. There was nothing particularly glamorous about it. There were still days when Brian spent hours creating something that almost nobody watched. A lot of them. There were channels that grew faster than others. Some ideas connected immediately. Some didn't. Some of Brian's favorite creations remained almost completely unnoticed. The audience was under no obligation to agree with him about which things were brilliant. They frequently exercised that right. Brian kept creating anyway. Because by now, the original purpose of all of this seemed almost impossibly far away. The music had started as somewhere to escape, somewhere to heal, somewhere to take things Brian didn't want to carry around anymore and turn them into something else. That had worked, maybe better than Brian could have expected, because eventually he stopped needing the music only as an escape. He started needing the act of creating itself, not in the same way. He wanted to know what else was possible. A song? Make it. An artist? Create one. A book? Write it. An audiobook? Figure it out. A fictional band? Give them names. A clothing line? Design it. A streaming platform combining several different forms of entertainment? Apparently add that to the list too. Brian didn't know whether all of it would work. That was still the part nobody could answer. There was no documentary crew arriving years later to interview a billionaire about how obvious his success had always been. This was happening now. The outcome hadn't been written yet. Brian was still trying to make the numbers work, still trying to grow the channels, still trying to turn attention into something sustainable, still trying to create enough income from the things he made that he could keep making them. Some parts were working, some weren't. Some hadn't been tried yet, and some were sitting in designs waiting for money. The platform was one of those. Brian could see it. He knew what he wanted it to become. He just couldn't build it yet. Yet. That word had become important, because almost everything surrounding Brian had once been something he couldn't do yet. Now he had music, albums, artists, channels, books, audiobooks, stories, characters, videos, clothing designs, an audience. Not the audience he hoped to have someday, the one he had now. The people who had already decided to spend some of their time inside the strange collection of things Brian kept creating. They were the beginning. Maybe all of this would eventually become the entertainment company Brian could now imagine. Maybe it would become something completely different. Brian had learned not to predict too far ahead. His predictions had a tendency to be interrupted by another idea. There was only one thing he knew for certain. He wasn't finished, not even close.
Stay a little longer.
Right here with me.
You said you should probably head home,
It's getting late and the night's moved on.
but you're still leaning on my truck.
Looking at me like you don't wanna leave. The stars ain't doing nothing new, but somehow they look different with you. Funny how a simple goodbye can turn into another hour.
We don't gotta say
Forever,
we don't gotta make a plan.
let's just stay right here together.
Let tonight be all we have. Stay a little longer.
Let the world keep spinning without us.
Ain't nobody rushing.
What's another minute if it's love?
Girl, your hand fits mine like it always knew the way.
If this night keeps feeling like this, attention. Every laugh starts another conversation. I can listen all night long, even when we don't say a thing. This old road's heard 1,000 songs, but tonight is singing our own. Every heartbeat saying, don't let this moment go.
Maybe this is how forever starts.
Not with fireworks,
Just two hearts.
finding home in the quiet.
Stay a little longer.
Till the moon gives way to daylight.
Tomorrow finds us here.
I think everything will be alright.
Girl, you make this whole world feel brand new somehow.
If you ask me where I wanna be, you already know it now. Stay a little longer. Don't say goodbye just yet. One more song, one more kiss, one more minute like this.
Part 10. The story isn't finished. There was no ending to this story. That was probably appropriate. Brian wasn't finished. Neither was anything he'd built. There was no point pretending otherwise. This wasn't the story of somebody looking back 20 years later from the top of a company worth millions of dollars. There was no giant office building with Brian Bailey Music Productions written across the front. No staff of hundreds. No streaming platform serving millions of people. No Country Scars clothing hanging in stores across the country. Those were possibilities. Some were plans, some were designs, some were still just ideas. The reality was considerably simpler. Brian was still sitting in front of a computer, still writing, still creating music, still making videos, still working on books, still checking numbers, still wondering why something he thought would do well didn't. Still occasionally wondering why something he didn't expect much from suddenly did. Still learning, still building. That was where the documentary caught him. In the middle. It was an unusual place to tell a story from. Most stories like this were told afterward. Someone succeeded. Then everybody went back and found the moments that supposedly explained why. The early struggle became part of the legend. Every decision looked intelligent because everyone already knew how it ended. Brian didn't have that advantage. He had no idea how this ended. He knew how it started. That part was easy. A job, a paycheck, a person who needed somewhere else to be for a while. So Brian wrote music. That was it. There was no Brian Bailey Music Productions. There was no Country Scars, no Southern Sync, no FrankenFusion, no Fifth Echo, no Lightly Bruised, no Personal Glowth. There was no Lady Country, no New Imaginations, no B. Rapsy, no Ashlyn, no FaithMix, no Think for Yourself Music, no Brianna Phillips, no Brian Bailey Cinematic Music Hub. There was no Brian Bailey Creative, no Brian Bailey Author, no Litterbox Fight Club, no Ninja Kittens. There weren't albums featuring Brian's own voice. There wasn't I Knew It Would Go This Way. There wasn't The Rescue Addiction. There weren't books people could spend hours listening to. There weren't characters strangers worried about. There wasn't a Country Scars clothing line waiting to become real. There wasn't a design for a platform combining music, video, audiobooks, and merchandise. None of it existed. Brian wasn't trying to build any of it. He was trying to feel better. Music gave him somewhere to put things. Pain could become lyrics. A memory could become a verse. Something Brian didn't know how to explain could sometimes make perfect sense once it became a song. Creating helped him heal, so he kept doing it. Then something changed. Brian started creating when he didn't need to escape anything. He'd think of something funny and want to make it. He'd imagine a story and want to write it. He'd hear a style of music he loved and wonder what his version of it might sound like. He wasn't trying to get away anymore. He was curious. That curiosity created Country Scars, then the other artists. It created songs that began with Brian's own recordings and became something larger. It created songs using tools that hadn't been available to people like Brian only a short time earlier. Then, Used to Be Yours found people, not millions. Enough. Enough to show Brian that something he'd created could leave his computer and mean something to somebody he'd never met. Then, late December came. Better than before, and a handful of those 98 Degrees style songs started bringing a little attention to Brian Bailey Music Productions. Again, not millions. Not even close. Just a small audience, but they came. Some stayed, and that small amount of attention never completely went away. In April, Brian released I Knew It Would Go This Way, his voice, his album. Then in June came The Rescue Addiction, another album. Another thing that had once existed only as an idea and now existed because Brian had decided to finish it. The collection kept growing. Then music wasn't enough. Brian started creating stories, books, audiobooks, characters, movie-style ideas, different kinds of videos. The escape had become a creative life. There was just one problem. Brian still had another life, the one that paid him. For a while, the two existed together. Brian went to work because work paid the bills. He created whenever he could because that was where he increasingly saw his future. Eventually, he didn't need to make some dramatic decision between them. The decision was made for him. The job ended. By then, Brian had already moved on in his mind. He had been moving on for a long time. He just hadn't been able to financially follow himself yet. Suddenly, he had time. He also suddenly had a very good reason to make that time count. So, he went all in. Not because the numbers said it was safe. They didn't. Not because there was guaranteed money waiting. There wasn't. He did it because he had spent enough time wondering what he could build if he gave it everything. Now he had the opportunity to find out. So he created, and created, and created some more. Some of it worked, some didn't. Some of it is still too new to know. Brian Bailey, author, began finding listeners. People started spending hours inside the stories. The music continued. Country Scars continued evolving. Brian Bailey Music Productions continued with the small audience it had built. More ideas appeared. Then more. Eventually, Brian started looking at everything he'd created and imagining what it might look like if it all existed together. One place, music, books, audiobooks, and video, merchandise, and artists, stories, a platform built around all of it. He designed it. He couldn't afford to build it. That was where things stood. Not at the end. Here, right now. There are still bills. There are still projects Brian wants to make that cost more money than he has available. There are still songs waiting to find an audience. There are still books waiting to be written. There are still channels that need to grow. There are still professional narrators Brian would like to hire. There are still stories he wants to turn into full videos. There is still a Country Scars clothing line waiting for the resources to make it real. There is still an entire platform waiting on the other side of a financial problem Brian hasn't solved yet. Maybe he will. Maybe the audience will keep growing. Maybe one of the books will become the thing that changes everything. Maybe Country Scars will. Maybe Brian Bailey Music Productions will. Maybe something Brian creates 6 months from now will make everything currently on that list look completely irrelevant. He doesn't know. Neither does anyone else. That's the interesting part. The story is still being written. There is an audience now. People listen to the songs. People spend hours with the books. People leave comments. Some come back every time something new appears. Every one of those people is now part of a story that started before they knew Brian existed. Somewhere along the way, Brian stopped creating only for himself. There were people on the other side now. People waiting for another chapter, another song, another story, another idea. That makes quitting considerably harder. Fortunately, Brian doesn't seem particularly interested in quitting. He still gets excited when an idea works. He still gets annoyed when something doesn't. He still occasionally creates something and thinks it might be one of the best things he's ever made, only to have the internet respond with almost complete indifference. Then he makes something else. That might be the most consistent part of the entire story. Brian keeps making something else. Maybe that's what Brian Bailey Music Productions really is, not a record label, not just a YouTube channel, not even the future platform Brian hopes to build. It's the result of one person repeatedly asking the same question: what else can I make? The answer keeps changing. Years ago, it was a song, then another song, then an artist, then another artist, then a channel, then an album, then another album, then books, audiobooks, characters, videos, clothing, a platform. Tomorrow, it could be something Brian hasn't thought of yet. That's why this story can't really have an ending. An ending would require Brian to stop creating long enough for somebody to write one. So this will have to do instead. There was once a guy who came home from work and started writing music because he needed somewhere else to be. The music helped him heal. Then it gave him somewhere to explore. Eventually, it gave him somewhere to go. He followed it. And somewhere along the way, he looked around and realized he'd built all of this. What happens next, Brian doesn't know. For now, he's back to work and using all of his spare time to create something else. Keep creating, Brian. We're all waiting to see what you come up with next.